boy, named Julian, stood covered in sweat, looking at his master, who was calling him a bastard. He thought about how he had never had anything valuable and how being a slave meant being completely denied and violently controlled. While thinking this, he ran off. Meanwhile, deep in the ocean, there was a huge ship with 100 slaves inside. A boy looking at the map asked the captain if they were really going through the hallowed zone, since many ships that went through there never came back. It was believed that those waters were cursed, and legends spoke of a mythical beast that hungered for sacrifices. The captain assured him that it was all fine since they were just passing by the edge of it. He explained that since the area was so dangerous, even warships and pirates avoided it, making it perfect for them to stay hidden. A soldier appeared, telling the captain that they found a boy. It was Julian, covered in injuries, blood flowing from his mouth and tied with ropes. The soldier asked if they should just kill him and throw him overboard. The captain looked at the boy and took a deep breath. The surrounding slaves did not agree with the soldier's suggestion, pointing out that Julian was just a kid. This made the captain furious, and he warned them that he really hated empty-headed people. He explained that they had only brought enough food for 100, and they didn't have any resources to share with him. A pregnant woman stepped forward and said she would split her food with him. Julian was shocked to see her, his eyes widening. A moment later, all the slaves started murmuring that they would split their food as well. The captain was angry to see this, but he just told them to shut up and do whatever they wanted. He then welcomed Julian, telling him he was now slave number 101. Hearing this, Julian smiled, grateful to be alive thanks to the other slaves who were willing to share their food. After some time, when Julian was set free, he was sitting with the other slaves. The pregnant woman asked him why he had sneaked onto the ship. He explained that he heard they could earn a living if they went to the continent, so he had decided to buy his freedom and live his own life. He then asked her why she had helped him despite not having anything to gain from it. With a smile, she told him that they valued compassion because no one treated them with basic human rights. Julian wondered if she could really help someone with nothing in return, so he asked her again, still confused. While looking at something in her hand covered in a piece of cloth, she smiled and said that helping others helped them maintain their pride as human beings. An old man watched them with a confused expression. She revealed the tool in her cloth. It was a knife. She told Julian that her husband had given it to her a long time ago, but she couldn't maintain it due to a lack of money, so it had rusted. Julian asked her to give it to him, promising to polish it. She wondered if he knew how to do it, and he told her that if it was a simple blade, he could handle it. In this way, he could also repay his debt for the food. The old man standing nearby asked how and where Julian had learned these skills. With sadness on his face, Julian explained that his mother had sold him for a pittance when he was very little, and his master was a blacksmith. He had learned these things there. He further revealed that he had done all kinds of chores while covered in ash and soot, and his master burned him with metal rods if he made even the slightest mistake. With sadness in her eyes, the woman looked at his arms, which bore the burn marks. Julian told her that when he saw his master was finally about to kill him, he grabbed a grindstone and attacked him. While polishing the knife, Julian told her that he had never been treated with compassion before, not even by his own mother, and he didn't know anything about it. He then looked at her and told her that he was done. He handed over the knife and advised her that if she exposed it to salty sea air, it would rust again, so she should take care of it. She smiled and showed him gratitude, asking for his name. He introduced himself as Julian, and with a cute smile, she introduced herself as Mera, telling him it was nice to meet him. At night, while everyone was sleeping peacefully, Julian noticed Mera sitting and touching her belly. He went to her and asked when the baby would be born. She told him it might be around the time they reached the continent. She held his hand and asked him to feel it. He was confused when he felt something moving. She smiled and told him it was the baby kicking because it was full of life. He looked at her in confusion, and she told him that her only hope was for this baby to be born safe and sound and live a happy life. She revealed that if she had any one wish, she wouldn't mind suffering for the rest of her life to ensure that. Hearing this, Julian was shocked because his own mother had sold him off for her needs. He felt his chest tighten, wondering why Mera would go so far for her child. It hurt him to realize that mothers like Mera existed. With tears in her eyes, Mera looked at him, held his hand, and gave him a hug. She tried to calm him down, understanding that he had never seen kindness in this cruel world. For the first time, he was so shocked by the kindness he witnessed that it made his chest tighten. She looked into his eyes and told him that even in this world, love and kindness existed. She requested that he not give up on his fellow man. He then went to his place to sleep. While lying down, he thought about the hug and the advice she had given him. After reflecting on it, he eventually fell asleep. The next morning, all the slaves were in a queue, taking their job assignments. When Julian reached the front, he said he wanted to do both his and Mera's jobs. A soldier punched him in the face, asking what made him think he could do something like that. Julian explained that he could work better than a pregnant woman, but the soldier warned him that if he made any mistakes, he would kill him. Mera asked Julian why he did that, and he told her that since her only wish was to have a safe delivery, he just wanted to see her happy. Hearing this, she smiled and thanked him for his kindness. After completing their work, they sat together to eat. The old man had given a portion of his food to Julian, so a boy asked the old man if he needed more, since he was old and they didn't want him to collapse, which would ultimately increase their workload. Julian, looking at his bread, asked the boy if he wanted some of his food. The boy replied that he hadn't stooped so low as to accept food from a kid. Julian was confused, so he looked at Mera, who told him that the boy had just said it was okay if Julian ate it all. At night, when everyone was sleeping, Julian noticed Mera sitting with her hands on her belly. He went to her, wondering if she couldn't sleep. She smiled and explained that lying down made her nauseous, and he realized how difficult it was to carry a child. He appreciated her effort, and she looked into his eyes, becoming a bit sad. It was the first time someone had praised her wholeheartedly, but she said she didn't think she deserved it because she wasn't the amazing mother he thought she was. Hearing this, Julian was a bit confused. Mera held his face and told him she had a son about his age who was killed by slave traders. He had died protecting her and her baby, so she felt like a mother who couldn't save her own child. She remembered her son's smile and felt like a failure. Because her son had given up his life for this baby, she wanted the baby to be born safely. Julian listened silently as she expressed her anxiety, wondering if her baby would ever find happiness in a cruel world like this. Julian stood up, looked into her eyes and hugged her, telling her how parents meant the whole world to their children. He assured her that her baby would love her so much and would find happiness, and he was praying for their happiness too. She was confused at first, but then she hugged him back and thanked him. As he did his work, Julian thought about Mera. He realized that being a mother was not just about cherishing a child because they were related by blood. It was about being connected with someone and starting to care for each other. He sensed that bond between Mera and her baby. He sat there thinking he had never experienced that mother-child bond because his own mother had sold him off. The thought frightened him that he might never be able to make that kind of connection for the rest of his life. In the evening, as the sun was setting, a boy asked why they couldn't see Jack. The soldier informed them that they wouldn't get their food until everyone had completed their duties by sunset, so he ordered them to work harder. Suddenly, Julian heard Mera calling him. He went to her and she pointed out to the sky, asking if it wasn't breathtaking. They both looked at it, and Julian was amazed by the sight. Mera mentioned that if they ever got freed and liberated, she would love to live together with him. Julian looked at her smile and blushed as he looked down. Mera said it would make her happy if he was by her side. Julian agreed to think it over. Then they went to sleep, lying beside each other. Suddenly, a soldier shouted that they had been pulled into the Allowed Zone. The captain, looking at the map, realized that they had taken a route he had tried to avoid, but they were not where the map indicated they should be. The soldier explained that something was trying to pull them in. The captain was shocked and wondered if they would be in the clear if they lightened the load. He then looked at all the slaves, deciding that they would be used for this purpose. The soldier announced that the slaves needed to come on deck. The slaves wondered if they were needed for maintenance, but the soldier said the crew was more than capable of managing the ship. When the old man questioned why they had been called, the soldier swiftly drove a sword into him and began laughing. The slaves were shocked, and Mera asked what was happening. The captain looked at them, placed his foot on the old man's body, and declared that he was a worthless elderly person who couldn't perform satisfactory work. He stated that he had bought them all for a cheap price and they were nothing more than defective goods. Announcing that they were all his property, he said he could exchange them for insurance money. The captain laughed loudly, boasting that there was no risk of any witnesses. The old man shouted for everyone to get out and the slaves began running in panic. The captain continued to laugh, taunting them about their shackles and announcing that they had nowhere to go. He ordered the soldiers to kill them all and throw their bodies overboard. In the chaos, the boy urgently told Julian to go to Mera, just before a soldier came and killed him as well. Julian, stunned by the sight, ran towards Mera. Within minutes, there were numerous dead bodies scattered on the ship, with blood everywhere. The captain looked at the carnage, and though impressed by the slaves' attempt to protect the pregnant woman and child, He saw it as a failure. Calling them all scum, he said that earning him some money was their best use, and ordered the soldiers to kill and dispose of the remaining bodies at sea. Suddenly, a huge wave crashed over the ship, freezing the soldiers in place. One of them informed the captain that something was wrong. They also felt raindrops beginning to fall. The captain was shocked to see a monstrous figure appearing behind the ship, and their ability to move was completely paralyzed. The monster materialized in front of Mera and Julian, asking if they sought its blessing. Both were terrified as they looked at the creature. The monster explained that there were two conditions to receive its blessing of power. First, they must sacrifice a large number of souls, and second, they must sacrifice their pure love. It revealed that the first condition had already been fulfilled, and now they had to decide who among them would be the sacrifice. Julian asked the monster who it was, but the creature replied that its identity was irrelevant. It took one and granted the other great power. The monster then asked them to decide which one of them would lose their pure love. Julian sat there crying loudly. He asked if one of them could live, and the monster confirmed it, saying that its blessing should ensure their safety. Julian then told Mera that he would offer his life so she could deliver her baby. He started walking toward the monster, but Mera stopped him, holding his wrist and insisting she wouldn't let this happen again. Julian was shocked as she held the knife and declared that she wouldn't let another of her children die. She would leave his new sibling with him. Julian tried to stop her, but Mera used the knife to pierce herself and give birth to the baby. She told Julian she didn't care what happened to her and looked at her child with a smile covered in blood. She hugged her and handed the baby to Julian, telling him that it was a girl and he should name her Diana. Mera expressed her love for both of them before walking away to sacrifice herself. The monster revealed it was satisfied and asked Julian to state his wish. Julian looked back at the captain and the soldiers, and he said he wanted proof that everyone's lives were not just a waste. The monster granted his wish and told the captain they could move now. The captain ordered the soldiers to kill the child and the monsters, and with their swords drawn, they charged at the monster, planning to sell it for a high price. As the soldiers ran toward the monster, a blast occurred, obscuring their vision. Julian appeared different as he held the captain and wondered what was happening. The monster informed Julian that he had been granted the life of 100 slaves. Their power, speed, endurance, and reflexes have been combined and bestowed upon him. The baby was crying, so Julian asked the soldiers to wait a little longer. They grew angrier and were about to attack him when within seconds, he killed them all with his bare hands. After finishing the soldiers, he turned his attention to the baby. Suddenly, the captain drove a sword into Julian's neck. The captain began laughing, mocking Julian for letting his guard down. Despite the wound, Julian remained alive and wondered why he was still breathing. The monster revealed that he had gained the lives of 100 dead slaves, which granted him some form of immortality. The captain was stunned and offered Julian 1/3 of his money if he spared him. Julian responded by smashing the captain's head in. He then took the baby and escaped on a small boat. The monster told Julian he didn't need to row, as the boat would reach the shore on its own. This was because the monster had received something dear to it as a sacrifice. The monster then destroyed the entire ship and vanished into the ocean. Julian looked at the sleeping baby and smiled through his tears. For the first time in his life, he possessed something truly valuable. Thus his new life began, carrying the weight of 100 souls. While sitting on the beach, Julian remembered Mera telling him that babies only express their needs by crying because they had no other way. He recalled her smiling and explaining how all they wanted was someone to assure them that they would never be left alone, to hold them tight and smile at them, which would soothe all their worries. He remembered how happy she was while telling him this. Now with a baby in his care, he tried to calm her in the same way, but she kept crying. Suddenly, he saw trouble ahead and wondered if the monster's promise of smooth sailing was just a lie. Fish-like monsters appeared around the boat, stating that they were ordered not to harm him, but they found it unfair and wouldn't accept it. They wanted to eat him and the baby. They were jealous that the monster had given Julian the blessing, and they intended to eat them even though they knew they would be punished for it. Julian held the baby tightly and wondered what their deal was. The monsters asked him to let him eat him, claiming they would make it quick. He realized they were associated with the octopus-like being and understood they could not leave the water, which was why they referred to the boat as land. The monsters informed him that their brethren had already begun to destroy the bottom of the boat, and soon both he and the baby would be their food. Julian took a deep breath and grabbed a wooden piece to use as a weapon. He jumped out of the boat and shouted, "Why don't you choke on this first?" as he pierced the sword into a monster multiple times. However, the fish was enormous and attacked back, piercing him all over his body. Julian tried to break free and fight back, but the fish held him tightly and continued to pierce him. He realized he couldn't keep up because the attacks were too fast. As he struggled to stop the fish, his vision started to blur. She held him tightly and told him she was there when it happened, so she knew he had 100 lives. She informed him that he was going to lose all of his lives and sink to the depths of the ocean to suffer. She started blaming him, saying the baby was a burden and questioning how he would live his life freely with that burden. She said she was no better than a slave again with a baby. She further expressed her sorrow for the baby, questioning how he intended to make it live a life without its mother. She asked if he couldn't see that if he died here, he could reunite with everyone. She told him that everything returns to the sea in the end, and not only he, but the baby would reunite with its mother too. She suggested that the three of them could be together there, deep in his thoughts. He wondered if it was true and started questioning himself. If he died, would he be able to see everyone again? Could he be with Mera there? He still remembered the day his mother sold him, the tiny amount of silver coins in her hand, and the happy look on her face. She didn't look back even once. He remembered how he used to live in a barn in the bitter cold and the pain of his burns, but he also remembered the warmth of Mera and the anguish he felt when he lost her. He saw her in his thoughts, calling him to come. He only wanted someone who would never leave him all alone. As he was dreaming of her, the baby suddenly started crying loudly. The sound reached his ears, bringing him back to the present. He realized that babies only express their needs by crying. He remembered Mera telling him they cry as hard as they can because they're saying, "Please, don't leave me all alone." He remembered that he could not let the baby live the same life he had, facing the hardships he endured. Determined to protect the baby, he awakened from the illusion. Freeing himself, he expelled the poison along with a smokescreen. The fish monster was shocked and tried to attack him, but he pierced through its body, killing it. The other sea monsters began murmuring about killing and eating him, so they started attacking. Julian shouted the baby's name and jumped toward the others, consistently killing all the smaller monsters until he finally cleared their route. After defeating all the fish, he sat inside the boat, covered in blood, looking at the baby. The baby had stopped crying and was looking at him. He apologized to her and promised that he would always be with her, realizing that he was not alone either. She looked at him and smiled. He told her that they were at the shore and would finally be able to reach land, expressing that he had enough of the sea as well. He came out of the boat thinking first of all he needed to find some help so that he could get some food and shelter to sleep. He looked at the baby thinking he must need to protect her, and his head was spinning because he was so exhausted and starved. Suddenly, a girl came in front of him. He looked at her and she noticed the baby in his hands. Her master appeared. He looked at her, noticed he was huge, and wondered if he was a soldier. He held back the girl and wondered if he was someone to attack. But the girl ran towards him, calling him Angvall, and told him that they were hurt. He noticed Julian's injuries and wondered what they were doing here. He asked them where their parents were. With a sad face, Julian told them that the baby's mother had died peacefully and asked if they could help them survive. The man asked them to follow, noting that the baby needed milk to live, and assured Julian they would provide some goat's milk. He also mentioned that Julian's wounds needed tending. Julian looked at him in confusion, but the man insisted, saying it wouldn't sit right with him if they were to die in this state. He ordered the girl named Titi to bring a needle and thread and some new clothes for the baby. While stitching Julian's wounds, the man wondered what could have happened to them. He noticed the wounds weren't fresh. As Julian's wounds were being stitched, he realized that his injuries were healing quickly now. He thought about how the more he used the power, the more his body seemed to adapt to it. After stitching his wounds, Angvall told Julian the clothes were a little too big for him. However, when Julian wore them, he looked like a decent boy. Angvall appreciated the sight and informed him that dinner was ready. They sat at the dinner table, where fruits and bread were laid out. Looking at the food, Julian admitted he had no money to pay. Angvall assured him that he wouldn't take money from him. Julian asked why he was doing all of this, and Angvall replied that it was only natural to take care of children and babies, and that he didn't need a reason for it. Hearing this, Julian remembered the moment when Mera told him how helping someone for nothing in return helped human beings maintain their pride. He smiled and thanked Angvall. He then asked if they had any clothes he could use, and Titi agreed. After that, he fed Diana, and Angvall instructed him to use the bedroom on the second floor. Julian told them he would return their favor someday and introduced himself and Diana. Angvall introduced himself and Titi. After the introductions, Julian went to the bedroom. While lying down, he thought he must sleep and couldn't stay awake any longer even if he tried. Just as he thought he could finally rest, Diana started crying. He held her, feeling annoyed, thinking that if she wouldn't stop crying, he could not sleep. He tried to calm her down, but she kept crying, so he thought about giving her some fresh air. Taking her outside the house, he saw armor on the ground and a woman bathing in the river. He looked at her and she came towards him. It was Angvall. She asked if he couldn't sleep and he explained that Diana wouldn't stop crying. She covered herself and Julian said he didn't realize she was a woman. She told him she never went out without her armor because she had a duty as a soldier to serve this country. During that time, Diana also stopped crying. There was complete silence for a few seconds while he looked at Diana. Angvall noticed and asked if something was weighing on him. He confessed that Diana didn't know her mother died instead of him, and she couldn't get angry or scream at him because she was too small. He said he should have stopped her and he should have died so they could have lived happily as mother and daughter, forming a proper family. Angvall told him there was no single right way to be a family. She revealed that Titi and she were not related by blood but were still a family. She advised him that family is what you make of it, not something predetermined or set in stone. She then asked him what kind of family he wanted to give to Diana. Hearing that question, he thought for a second, his emotions uncontrolled, and said he wanted to give her all the things he had lost: a home, food, wealth, and most importantly, love. He said he wanted her to live without any worries and free from any suffering. Angvall told him that was quite a task to undertake and that he would have to fight with all his strength on her behalf. He wondered what he had to fight against, and she told him it was this cruel world. She emphasized that there was no time to hesitate, nor room for guilt. She further told him that he needed to give his all to survive and raise her, and that was how he could give her a happy life. She said that perhaps in doing so, he might find a way to forgive himself. She mentioned that money could buy happiness, so he needed to look for a job, but for now, he needed some rest. She advised him not to do everything on his own since he is still full of grief. Standing up, she told him she would take care of his wounds until they had healed. Julian expressed how he had never met many kind-hearted people and told her about the 100 people on the ship. Hearing that, she smiled hesitantly, saying that was a lot of people. Half a year later, Titi informed Julian that lunch was ready. Julian, with Diana, who had grown a bit, wondered if Diana wanted to see something because she was moving a lot. He looked around and told Diana there was nothing, but she had seen an animal in the forest looking straight at her. Before Julian ran away from his master, he wasn't even treated as a person. Julian's master was sitting on a bench when his friend came over and told him he had advised against getting a child slave. However, Julian's master replied that it was fine because he would dispose of him once he was no longer useful. Hearing that, his friend laughed, saying that it was messed up, but Julian's master called it kindness. He said that since Julian was sold off by his own mother, he had no place to escape to. He believed that he was doing Julian a favor because if he couldn't live a normal life, he would be better off dead. Returning to the present, Julian told Angvall that he wanted to find a job. After staying there for 6 months, he was eager to earn some money on his own so he could repay her and save up for Diana's future. Angvall smiled and said they could help him find a job in a nearby village. They traveled to the village where a man informed them that they didn't want someone who couldn't pull their own weight. He called Julian a burden and said he would be an inconvenience to the entire village. Julian requested the chance to prove himself, insisting he would do whatever was required. The man, however, said they couldn't trust an outsider just like that and asked Julian to prove he wouldn't be a drag. The man then showed him the entrance to a cave and explained that it was where they mined for iron. He showed Julian how the cave entrance was blocked by stones and revealed it was about 10 meters deep. If Julian could remove all the boulders, they would consider taking him on. Angvall called it madness, pointing out that even an adult would find it nearly impossible. She questioned if the man was being too harsh. The man insisted that no one was forcing Julian, and Julian, determined, said he would do it. Julian began by removing one of the stones, finding it relatively easy and hoping the rest would be the same. He lifted and removed the stones one by one, while everyone watched him with stoic expressions. The man observed that Julian had cleared a little over half of the obstruction, but he was completely exhausted. Julian continued to lift more stones, noticing that his hands and legs were becoming swollen and he could hardly move anymore. He looked at Diana's smile and continued his task, determined to finish it. Despite his efforts, he struggled to lift the remaining stones and was drenched in sweat. He questioned what he was doing and wondered if he really had to crawl on his knees to get the job done. Suddenly, in his thoughts, the image of the slaves appeared, suggesting that using them would make the task effortless. He smiled at the thought, reflecting on how he had always been rescued by others, just like on the ship. He realized he was just a kid who had been kept alive by those around him. He told himself not to take the easy way out, thinking that if he couldn't handle this challenge, how could he ever bring peace or be trusted to manage anything? With renewed resolve, Julian lifted the bag full of stones, remembering Mera and the promise he had made. He was determined to handle everything on his own, just as he promised. He continued removing the stones, pushing through the exhaustion. The man questioned if Julian had done enough to earn the job, while the other girl pointed out that he was just a kid. Angvall, angered by the remarks, told them to be quiet, saying they were the ones who started the situation. After a moment, Julian stood before the cleared space, exhausted and covered in sweat, and informed them that all the stones had been removed. The man approached, acknowledging that Julian was more than qualified for the job. He not only offered Julian the position, but also gave him money as compensation. Julian smiled gratefully, and afterward, he made a grave for Mera and prayed for her. Back at home, Julian called for TT and Angvall, excited to show them that Diana had started crawling. TT expressed her excitement, and they all shared a moment of joy and laughter together. Julian began working and entrusted Diana to Marie, a nurse who cared for her and was the wife of Joseph, with whom Julian worked. Joseph treated Julian as an equal, and they were tasked with chopping firewood for the village. Julian enjoyed the work, appreciating the beautiful environment of the forest. Joseph asked if Julian knew that his child and Diana were of the same age and expressed excitement about seeing them become best friends in the future. Julian agreed with a smile. Meanwhile, Angvall arrived and brought Julian's lunch, prompting TT to excitedly suggest they eat together. As they sat down to eat, Angvall asked if they had noticed anything unusual about the forest. Joseph, slightly amused, replied that there was nothing out of the ordinary and that the forest was as peaceful as ever. However, he added that they did not know what lay deeper inside, as Pops once warned him about it. They looked at the forest, and Joseph explained that its depths were unknown. It was said to be a sacred domain for gods and beings beyond human comprehension, and no one had ever returned from there. He mentioned that it would be quicker to ask his Pops directly, but age had clouded their minds, and they always stayed hidden in the forest. Angvall agreed, saying she had tried several times to visit him, but it never worked out. Joseph offered to try and arrange a meeting for her, and she thanked him. When they returned home, Julian asked Angvall why she was investigating the woods. She explained that it was the king's order, and that it was both her duty and honor to see it through. Julian admitted he didn't know much about the king, and she informed him that the king she served had been ruling the country for over 100 years. Julian wondered how anyone could live that long, but she said she didn't know. She added that the king protected the country throughout his reign with mysterious godlike powers, and the citizens hailed him as the Supreme Lord. Julian was taken aback by this revelation. Angvall continued, explaining that one of the king's close aides was a prophet who supported him from the shadows. This prophet had foreseen the king's death and had predicted a calamity that would emerge within the forest. Angvall said that the prophecy was considered accurate and that the king had immense trust in the prophet, as past predictions had never been wrong. She also shared that she was forever indebted to the king because he had saved her and her family. This was why she had become a soldier, to serve her king and country. Julian wondered if she had to investigate the forest all by herself, but she assured him that she did not. Numerous scholars and soldiers were assigned to different parts of the forest, and she asked him to let her know if he noticed anything unusual. Afterwards, Joseph took Angvall to meet Pops. Angvall asked him if he had heard any tales about the woods from long ago. Pops looked around confusedly and remained silent for a moment before answering. He said he had heard tales about monsters, evil spirits, witches, and fairies, stories that people made up based on their understanding. He wasn't sure if any of it was true, but he knew there was no reason to get involved. If they left these creatures alone, they could coexist in peace. Pops also advised Angvall not to meddle with the forest's wild inhabitants. After giving this advice, Pops began searching for a spoon. Joseph told Angvall that they were going hunting the next day and promised to let her know if they noticed anything unusual. Angvall thanked him for his help. Meanwhile, Julian was playing with Diana near the house, bringing her closer to the forest. Diana had been crying earlier, but as she looked at the forest, she started to smile. Julian smiled as well and noted that it was getting chilly, suggesting they should head home. As he looked at the forest, he sensed something different but decided there was nothing to be concerned about. The next day, some men reported to their boss that Joseph was missing. They explained that he had gone into the forest to check on the rabbits, but something had dragged him away. The boss was confused and asked if it might have been a bear or something similar. The man insisted that it was not a bear, but something different that had taken Joseph. The other workers were shocked by the news. Marie was in tears, worrying about what she would do without him. Angvall tried to console her and suggested organizing a search party. They would investigate the outer edges of the forest surrounding the village, while she would venture into the depths to look for Joseph. Pops arrived and said he would join the search since he knew the forest better than anyone. Marie informed him that it was his son, Joseph, who was missing. Pops reassured her, saying that there was no need to fear because he had taught Joseph how to survive in the forest. He told Marie that Joseph must be alive. Meanwhile, Julian thought he might be able to help with his powers, so he told Angvall he wanted to join the search. Angvall declined his offer, stating that they didn't have time to debate it. She ordered TT to take Diana and Julian home and to wait there. On their way back home, TT asked Julian if they would be alright and if Angvall would return. Julian looked at Diana, remaining silent for a moment as he thought about the happy moments with TT, Angvall, Marie, and Joseph. He recalled Mera's words and then told TT to take care of Diana for him. With a reassuring smile, he said everything would be okay. He then turned towards the forest, activating his powers. They entered the forest, accompanied by Pops and an archer. Pops demonstrated a signal that would indicate he would be distracting any beast they encountered. The archer expressed a wish to become a master huntsman like Pops, but Pops advised him that becoming a master wasn't as important as being able to return home and share a meal with his family, rather than being consumed by the forest. Pops shared that many hunters dreamed of dying in the woods, but it brought hardships to the families left behind. He had seen many friends die in the forest and did not want to lose another. The boy replied that he also didn't want to be left behind. As they continued their search, Pops noted that there wasn't much blood, which was bad news because it suggested Joseph had been dragged a significant distance. Angvall asked what kind of beast could have made the tracks, and Pops admitted that he didn't know, as he had never seen such footprints before. He advised them to proceed with caution, reminding her to keep an eye on their path and the sun's position. Despite his age, Pops moved through the forest with ease. As they walked, Pops warned that the swamps were bottomless and instructed Angvall to stay close behind him and not to fall in no matter what. Suddenly, he spotted a bear nearby and warned Angvall to remain still. He drew his bow and shot at the bear, explaining that he didn't have time to deal with it properly and had forgotten to bring the bells that would have scared it away. Angvall was stunned, but Pops urged her to calm down, assuring her that while his mind might be muddled, he never missed his shot. They reached the point where Pops admitted he was unfamiliar with the area. By the scent, he determined it was neither a bear nor a boar's. Angvall noticed that no sunlight or wind reached this place, and that the further they went, the more alien it became. The air was stagnant, heightening her sense of unease. Out of the blue, they noticed a huge tree surrounded by dead bodies. Both Pops and Angvall were stunned at the sight. The bodies were hanging from the branches. Suddenly, Joseph shouted at them, warning them that it was a trap and urging them to stay away. From the tree, a monstrous wolf-like creature spoke, revealing that they had fallen into a trap. It explained that they only needed the blessed child of the sea and hoped that he would come. Since he hadn't, they would settle for one bait, and the rest might be killed. Angvall wondered if it was all real or just a nightmare. Pops, recognizing the clothes of the dead, realized they were his friends. The monster laughed, confirming that they were indeed his friends. It revealed that preying on humans was their hobby because they were easily frightened, quick to cry, and scream for help. The monster found it hilarious when its victims begged to go home and cried for their daughters. Pops remained expressionless upon hearing this, which puzzled the monster. It wondered why he was making such a face and declared that they would hang him up with his friends so they would all reunite. Pops responded that he never thought he could harbor this much anger at his old age. He explained that the relationship between a hunter and a beast was eat or be eaten, and he had accepted that. He was prepared for death, but he found the monster's nature to be nothing but that of a cold-blooded killer. The monster, growing angry, agreed that they were indeed cold-blooded killers. It then began attacking indiscriminately, damaging trees and everything around them. Angvall immediately grabbed Pops and Joseph, trying to save them. They fled from the scene covered in blood, but they managed to escape with Joseph. During that time, Julian came running into the forest, trying to locate Angvall with his powers. Before he could find her, he encountered a bear. Without wasting any time, he punched the bear and dashed inside, determined to find them as quickly as possible. Meanwhile, Angvall, along with Joseph and Pops, was trying to fight off the monster. The monster was completely out of control and Angvall was heavily injured. Pops and Joseph supported her, with Pops informing them that the monster didn't have any eyes and tracked them through sound and scent. Angvall asked Pops what was inside his bag. He replied that it contained some herbs and aromatic ingredients he had gathered, which could block the monster's smell for a while. However, she pointed out the smell of her blood, and he told her that they were going to turn the tables using that very smell. He readied the liquid form of the herbs and instructed Angvall to cover herself entirely with it, then soak a cloth with her blood. They prepared the bait, and Joseph informed them that the monster was approaching, hungrily searching for them by scent and sound. Pops noted that the monsters were similar to animals, which meant hunters had a chance. However, the monster was faster than they had anticipated. It caught them in its grasp, but they didn't make a sound. And with the herbs masking their scent, it could recognize them properly and eventually let them go, leaving them heavily injured. The monster realized its sense of smell was completely messed up and decided to hang them while they were still alive. Covered in blood, Pops and Joseph looked at each other. Joseph, holding the soaked cloth, gave a signal to Pops and started running towards the monster. The monster noticed the smell of the cloth and tried to attack it, but Joseph threw the cloth into the air. The monster started trying to catch it, thinking it had tricked them. Angvall then revealed that they were at the bottomless swamp, which made the monster panic. It then realized that rather than hanging them, it might tear them to shreds. Joseph told Pops not to miss a shot. Pops, ready with his bow, asked Joseph who he thought he was talking to, then took a shot, breaking one of the monster's arms. He ran towards Angvall, asking if she was okay. He noticed that not only Angvall, but also Joseph was heavily injured. Suddenly, they saw a different kind of monster emerge from the original monster's mouth with branches on its face. It attacked Angvall, who tried to protect Pops and Joseph with her armor. She was already extremely injured, and the monster kept attacking her. Just as it was about to pierce her with its blade, Julian came, kicking the monster into the air. All three of them were shocked to see Julian. With his face set in a determined expression and his powers activated, he told them that he was glad he made it in time and asked them to get behind him. The monster taunted Julian, asking if he understood his situation. It said he belonged to the sea, and now it would kill both the baby and Julian. Julian responded, telling the monster it was the one who didn't understand, and now he would make it eat its words. The monster came running toward Julian to strike, but Julian dashed towards it, dodging all its attacks and punching it into the air. The monster hit a tree, breaking it. Angvall noticed Julian's unbelievable speed and wondered just how strong he was. Julian saw the monster hide inside the tree, making it difficult to see. Suddenly, the monster appeared behind him and attacked his shoulder with its blade. As it was about to strike again, Julian jumped and punched the tree, breaking it into pieces. Realizing the monster had already moved, Julian used his powerful senses to defend against its next attack. After dodging its strikes, he jumped and kicked the monster into the air. Angvall shouted, telling Julian that he was bleeding, but he told her he was fine. Julian noticed that the monster's strength lay in its ability to move freely while hiding underground and inside trees, and that it could heal itself. However, he knew he was stronger and determined to smash it to pieces before it could hide again. The monster readied for its next move, sharpening its thorns and attacking Julian. Julian blocked the thorns with his body, causing his blood to flow out. The monster attacked with the thorns again, and Julian's whole body was pierced through with them. Angvall shouted from behind, telling Julian that he didn't need to protect them. Julian, however, remembered when he was a slave. His master had a narcissistic personality and used to beat the other boy as well. The master was never happy, whether they were obedient or rebellious, and there was nothing they could do to please him. Julian recalled a time when his master beat up the boy, and when Julian tried to ask if he was okay, the master beat him too, telling him that nothing good ever came out of helping others. But when Angvall saved him and Diana, she said that adults didn't need a reason to care for children. Now he realized it didn't matter whether they were children or adults. He'd always hated himself for doing nothing and just watching. Now he was glad he could help other people, and he believed that helping others was what it meant to be human. He ran towards the monster, knowing it had limited thorns and needed to charge up before it could attack again. Taking advantage of this opportunity, he started striking the monster. The monster tried to push him off, but he told it that there was no space in the sky to escape. He threw it into the air and punched through it, breaking it into pieces. After he broke the monster into pieces and landed on the ground, covered in blood, the monster cursed him and all of them, commanding the forest to kill them. Julian understood and ordered the three of them to run immediately through the forest and leave it. He told them he would hold the enemy back until then. Angvall looked at him and with a smile he told her, "Let's all go home." They started running in the opposite direction to exit the forest while Julian fought the monsters within. He was caught by a spider but used his power to break all of its arms to free himself. As he ran to escape, he encountered a different type of monster covered in branches. It created illusions of him being torn to pieces. This monster was as powerful as the sea-level creatures and was trying to control its own mind. Meanwhile, the three of them finally emerged from the forest and noticed that the monsters were no longer pursuing them. Their families rushed to greet them. Marie ran to hug Joseph, expressing her happiness, and TT ran to meet Angvall. Julian also arrived, having freed himself from the monsters and the forest. He saw a woman examining Angvall and asked her who she was. She then introduced herself as Ravenna, the village doctor. They went inside the house and Ravenna wondered how they had gotten into such a situation. Joseph and Pops looked at Angvall sadly as she lay unconscious. Ravenna instructed Julian to rest and go to bed, as she needed medicine, and then she left. Julian and TT sat beside Angvall's bed while she slept. TT shared that a long time ago, during a conflict at the western border, many residents of nearby towns perished, including her parents. She was very young at the time and Angvall took her in, raising her like an older sister. TT had never felt hatred, only gratitude, but she still blamed herself for that day because the soldiers had been powerless. She smiled and thanked Julian for saving Angvall. Julian looked at her with a sad expression and told her not to thank him. He expressed that it might all be his fault. Judging from the words and actions of the monsters, he thought that they might have had a grudge against him and Diana, perhaps even hating her because she was born at sea. He looked stressed as he lamented that because of him, they had nearly all died. He wondered if it was his fault and considered leaving the village soon. Suddenly, Angvall woke up and said that the monsters could not leave the forest. TT, shocked that Angvall had woken up, apologized for making her worry and told Julian that everything had been fine until he went near the forest. Julian insisted that he wanted to avoid any possibilities that could endanger them. She pulled his cheeks and reassured him that he was not alone, saying that they were a family. TT smiled, said they would face their problems together, and hugged both Julian and Angvall. The next morning at breakfast, Julian mentioned that he was considering moving away. He explained that he didn't want to live near the forest anymore and didn't want to put others in danger. TT asked where he wanted to move, and he replied that he was thinking of relocating to the sea. Excitedly, TT said that she has always wanted to live by the sea. Julian was confused, wondering what she was implying. He clarified that he was only considering moving out with Diana. TT, however, insisted that they were all moving together and asked Angvall if she agreed. Angvall smiled and confirmed that they would all move together, leaving Julian shocked by the decision. Julian then said they needed to inform Joseph and the others. As he was leaving, TT waved at him and asked Angvall to do the same. TT explained that it was their way of wishing him a safe trip. Angvall waved at him, understanding the gesture. Julian went to Joseph and shared his plans about moving and building a house by the beach away from the village, with the intention of visiting the village regularly. Joseph thought it was a good idea and mentioned that if Julian caught fish, they could buy some from him. Pops also offered to introduce Julian to a carpenter friend of his, which excited Julian. Returning to Angvall and TT, Julian told them the news, and they started discussing where to build the house. He noticed that Angvall was writing something and asked if it was okay for her to be up. TT explained that Angvall was preparing a report for the king regarding the forest incident. Angvall added that the report was about a prophecy and the high possibility that the monsters could lead to the king's death. She couldn't overlook such a critical issue. Julian was surprised by her dedication and pointed out how much faith she had in him. Angvall explained that it was because the king had never turned back from his principles. He had abolished slavery in larger settlements and granted people status and jobs. Julian was shocked to hear this. Angvall continued that soon, slavery would be banned throughout the entire country, and Julian was relieved to hear this, as he had been worried about Diana's future. The next day, they went to the beach to find a place to build their new home. Julian mentioned that they could catch fish there as well. TT asked if he had ever caught a fish and pointed out that it wasn't easy. However, when Julian cast the net, many fish rushed to it, and TT was astonished by the catch. As they were analyzing the area, a carpenter arrived and inquired if they were planning to build a house and whether they intended to demolish their previous one and use its wood. Julian explained that they planned to use the old house as a resting spot when they visited the village. The carpenter then noted that they would need more lumber for the new house. Julian said he would gather all the materials himself, but the carpenter remarked that it would be too much for one person. Julian insisted that he could handle it. He went to a spot closer to the ocean where many trees were growing. Using his powers, he cut down the trees and collected the wood. Soon, they began constructing the house, and within a few days, it was completed. Julian and the carpenter stood together, discussing the finished house. The carpenter mentioned that Julian should thank him for saving an old friend, to which Julian expressed his gratitude. TT waved at Julian, complimenting the house. They all went inside, and Julian mentioned that Diana would be turning 1 year old. Meanwhile, in the capital, Rungbalkar, a woman reported to the king that she had important information about the forest from Angvall. The king instructed her to verify if it was related to the prophecy. She expressed concern that her powers were not suited for battle, but the king assured her that Aros would be sent as well. She wondered if Aros was not currently defending the western border. At the western border, Aros sat in his chair with his maid beside him, mentioned that he had already consumed half a jug of drink. The maid informed him that there were about 500 enemy soldiers, but questioned why they were crossing the border with such a small force and whether they truly intended to win. Meanwhile, the maid also brought up the incident reported from the south, which was related to the prophecy, and told him he was requested to go to that location. Arco's eyes lit up with excitement as he smirked, thinking that this new development was far more interesting than his current situation. As Angvall read the book, she remembered the loss of her mother. Her father had told her how her mother had smiled at him in her final moments, a fearless soldier who died on the battlefield. He described how she always smiled even when she knew her time had come, leaving him with a memory of her smile. Her father had always smiled at her until the very end, but Angvall had never been as adept at smiling as her parents. While she was lost in these thoughts, TT appeared to inform her that Diana had stood up on her own. She called Diana a genius and amazing. Angvall smiled, thinking that she could certainly smile in front of these children, as she watched TT, Julian, and Diana playing together happily. At the western border, soldiers approached Aros and asked what he was doing sitting there, informing him that the area would soon become a battlefield. They offered him a chance to leave, but Aros smirked and asked if they were afraid he wouldn't let any of them go. When the soldier demanded an explanation, Aros used his magic to destroy the soldier's head and neck. The other soldiers were shocked and began attacking him, but Aros remained seated in his chair. More soldiers attempted to strike him, but he effortlessly reduced them to meet with his gaze. The maid asked him to control the chaos, but Aros replied that he didn't care and expressed his boredom. In the village, prophetess Elstri arrived with some guards. Angvall welcomed her, and Elstri thanked her for the report. She explained that while her prophecies always come true, the details sometimes vary. Though she might not always identify a monster, person, or unknown entity, she could recognize anything that might lead to the king's death once she laid her eyes on it. Elstri expressed her desire to speak with everyone who had seen the monster in the forest, and Angvall promised to gather them soon. Meanwhile, at the western border, Aros had killed all the soldiers while seated on his chair. With only one body left in front of him, he blasted it and then poured himself a glass of water, commenting that he didn't even need half a glass to drink. He told his maid that it was no fun and that they should head to the village now. Smirking, he added that he was looking for a new toy that wouldn't break even if he used all his powers. Inside the house, while TT was playing with Diana, she asked how old he was. Julian replied that he wasn't sure, but he guessed he was around 13 to 15, and he didn't even know his birthday. TT smiled and suggested they celebrate both his and Diana's birthdays on the same day. She asked Angvall if she liked the idea, and Angvall smiled and agreed, noting that she might receive a reward for reporting the forest anomaly, so they could have a special celebration for both birthdays that night. Julian smiled, excited because it would be the first time celebrating his birthday. TT noticed his enthusiasm and said they should start preparations. She asked Julian to come with her to catch some fish for the celebration. Angvall mentioned that she was going to meet prophetess Elstri and informed Julian that Elstri would arrive at noon to ask about the events in the forest. She asked him to cooperate, and Julian acknowledged this. Meanwhile, TT and Julian went to the sea to catch some fish. TT held Diana while Julian fished. She pointed out how beautiful the sunrise was, and both she and Diana smiled at the view. Julian felt as if he were dreaming. Each day was peaceful, and he was living a modest but blessed life with his family. He noticed that it had been unusually calm lately, and wondered if the happiness might continue forever. TT then mentioned seeing clouds in the distance, suggesting that it might rain tonight. On the other hand, Angvall went to see the prophetess, who was questioning the witnesses about the monster in the forest.
The prophetess stated that she would handle any threats aimed at the king and asked Angvall to call the witnesses one by one. First, Joseph appeared and began explaining the details. He described the monster as a gigantic beast with multiple heads that could understand human speech. When asked if the monster spoke or behaved in a particular way, Joseph said that it wanted to kill everyone. Pops then took his turn and described a similar monster that appeared in human form. He added that the creature wanted to kill them as well, and mentioned that everything in the woods, including insects and beasts, turned against them. The prophetess inquired about their thoughts on why the monsters wanted to kill them. Joseph replied that he didn't know the exact reason, but it was clear that the monsters had some kind of objective. Elstri thought that there was no immediate connection to the king's death, but she felt she needed to see things with her own eyes. When Angvall went to call Julian, Elstri sensed a strange aura beginning to appear and wondered about the unsettling darkness in the atmosphere. As Julian appeared in front of her, Elstri was struck with fear and disbelief. She was shocked at how she had so greatly misinterpreted the details of the prophecy. Breathing heavily and covered in sweat, she shouted in confusion, asking what was happening. Pointing at Julian, she declared that he was the reason for the king's downfall and the darkness that would engulf the world in flames. Julian asked Angvall what was happening. Angvall responded that Elstri was wrong and questioned how she could make such an accusation. She pointed out that there was no way Julian would harm the king, and he had no reason to do so. Elstri clarified that she wasn't referring to Julian, but to the little girl he was holding. She claimed that the girl was destined to bring death simply by existing, as she possessed an ancient and destructive soul. Julian was shocked by this revelation. He protested, saying that Mera sacrificed her life to give birth to the girl and insisted she was born to be loved. Even if Elstri was joking, he could not forgive her. However, Elstri insisted that they must kill the baby while she was still an infant, or else it would be much harder to do as she grew older. She ordered Angvall, as the king's representative, to carry out the execution immediately. Julian, seeing Angvall standing before him, recalled how peaceful things had been recently. He thought that this happiness might last forever, but now faced with this grim reality, he felt the weight of the impending darkness. In the past, at the Western Border headquarters, the prophetess Elstri called Angvall and informed her that she was appointed as the king's guard for her heroic deeds in battle. Angvall bowed before the king, showing her honor and gratitude, but she declined the opportunity. Both the king and Elstri were shocked by her decision. Angvall then showed them Titi, whose parents had been killed, and explained that she wanted to raise the girl in their stead. She humbly requested time for that purpose. Elstri called her reason preposterous. The king stood up and walked forward. He approached Angvall and told her that the responsibility for Titi's parents rested with him as the king. He deeply apologized and ordered Elstri to provide sufficient compensation to all subjects harmed by the war. He then told Angvall that in the southern lands, there was a peaceful district abundant in nature. He ordered her to give Titi a new life there, build a house for her, and provide a place of solace and refuge. Angvall was shocked to hear this. She bowed her head and expressed her gratitude towards the king, declaring her willingness to lay down her life for the sake of the land. She vowed that if the king ever needed her, she would rush to any battlefield and slay the enemy, no matter who they might be. In the present time, Elstri told Angvall that as the representative of the king, her orders were the king's orders. She commanded Angvall to kill the child. Angvall, covered in sweat, hesitated and told Elstri she might be mistaken. However, Elstri insisted she had seen a glimpse of a new future and used her magic to show that future to Angvall. Seeing the terrifying vision, Angvall fell to the ground, overwhelmed by its destructiveness. She then wore her helmet, stood up, and asked Julian to hand over Diana. Julian, holding Diana, rushed away as soldiers surrounded them, and people looked on in confusion, unsure of what was happening. Meanwhile, inside the house, Titi had done so many preparations for the birthday celebration. Suddenly, Joseph opened the door and informed her about the situation. She ran towards the village and saw a crowd gathered. She dashed towards them and saw Angvall and Julian facing each other while Diana sat nearby. Elstri warned Angvall that if she tried to protect the baby, the villagers would face retribution for betraying their country. She added that it would be a greater punishment if someone else suffered in Angvall's place. The villagers, confused and anxious, asked what was happening. The soldiers informed them that they had done nothing wrong, but warned that crossing a certain line would brand them as traitors to be purged. He ordered them to remain silent. Meanwhile, Julian pleaded with Angvall to stop, but under the pressure from Elstri, she couldn't act freely. Julian insisted that Elstri was manipulating her, but Angvall claimed she was acting of her own volition and for Diana's sake. Julian didn't believe her and reminded her that they had lived together as a family. Angvall moved forward and punched him, telling him she believed in him and Diana, and that the future Elstri showed her was a lie. However, she couldn't disobey orders. She pressured Julian, begging him to kill her and run away, and that way he and the villagers would be safe. She explained Elstri wouldn't hesitate to make sacrifices in the name of the Supreme Lord, and ending her life would be easy for him with his powers. Julian pleaded with Angvall to stop as he kept dodging her attacks. Titi started crying, shouting for Angvall to stop. Both Julian and Angvall looked extremely tired, breathing heavily. Julian told Angvall that they were going to leave the country and never return, begging them not to kill Diana. Angvall told him he didn't understand. They wouldn't give up and insisted he fight her. He remembered a time when he asked what kind of life he wanted to give Diana, and he replied that he would have to fight with all his strength for her in this cruel world. She held him tightly and urged him to fight. He refused to use his powers to hurt his family, but Angvall said she couldn't take it anymore. Elstri commanded Angvall to draw her sword and end it. Angvall unleashed her sword and looked at Diana and Julian, torn between her family and her loyalty. The entire village was gathered, watching Angvall and Julian face each other. When Angvall unleashed her sword, Elstri ordered her to kill the baby immediately, stating that the future of their king and country was at stake. A soldier approached Elstri, asking her to go to the castle and leave the situation to them, but she refused, saying she wanted to see where Angvall's loyalty lay. She declared that the betrayal of the Supreme Lord was absolutely unforgivable. The soldier thought that Elstri was a complete fanatic. Julian was stressed, wondering what the right move was. He considered taking Elstri as a hostage, but realized it could result in complete destruction. With soldiers and villagers too close, he couldn't fight effectively while holding Diana. He looked at the villagers, he saw Marie, and remembered a conversation where he expressed his worries about Diana's life. Marie had told him to look at Joseph and their children. She assured Julian he was a good person and that worrying was natural, but it was important for Diana to have someone to proudly look up to. She thanked Julian for saving Joseph and expressed her confidence that he would raise Diana well. When Julian and Marie saw each other, Marie had tears in her eyes and remembered her own words. She apologized to Joseph and started walking towards Julian. As they crossed the line, the soldier was shocked to see their determination. Angvall asked why Marie and Joseph were doing this. Marie explained that Julian had risked his life to save her husband, and that was all the reason she needed. Inspired by them, Pops also crossed the line. One by one, all the villagers began crossing the line, coming to stand in front of Julian. Julian smiled, seeing them standing up for him. The villagers declared that Julian and Diana were part of the village, and they wouldn't let anyone harm them any further. They all stood together, protecting them, as Julian had tears in his eyes. Titi told Angvall it had gone far enough and tried to calm her, urging her not to bear the burden alone. Elstri observed the scene and told a nearby soldier that the villagers didn't understand the gravity of the situation, and that it seemed that they must wipe the entire village off the map. She then ordered the knight Guillaume to slaughter them all. Guillaume commanded the soldiers to draw their weapons, preparing to attack the villagers. Elstri ordered the soldiers to slaughter everyone. Joseph helped Pops climb up the house to get a better view for his archery. Meanwhile, Angvall attacked multiple soldiers at once with her huge sword. Elstri looked at Angvall angrily, and suddenly Pops attacked Elstri, but the commander protected her from his arrows, and the commander told her to stand back and ordered the soldiers to keep the enemy in check and take her somewhere safe. Angvall looked at Julian and apologized. He smiled and said it was all right, understanding that her intentions were pure. Angvall ordered Julian to take Diana and Titi and leave the place because he couldn't fight while holding Diana. Julian asked about her and she explained that their target was Diana, so if he ran away, they would have to chase him. This would split their forces, allowing her to protect the villagers. She then asked if he could defeat the chasers. He agreed, and then Titi hugged her. She hugged her back, telling her that all four of them would leave the village. She assured her that everything would be all right, and said they would meet up beyond the eastern grasslands, where she was sure they could live together peacefully. Angvall then charged at the enemy, sending them flying with a single strike, and signaled Julian and the others to run away. A guard appeared in front of him, declaring that he wouldn't let them escape. He was ready to attack, but suddenly, an arrow pierced his arm. He wondered how someone could attack so precisely from that distance while looking at Pops. Julian smiled, grateful to Pops, and ran away with Titi. Elstri ordered some of the soldiers to chase after the baby, revealing her importance. Julian asked Titi to divert them as much as she could to make it easier for Angvall. Meanwhile, the villagers were panicking, and Joseph told them to remain calm and asked the children and women to get behind them. During this, Angvall was effortlessly destroying the soldiers. The commander of the guards in Elstri watched her in amazement. They realized why she was considered a heroic warrior and understood it wouldn't be easy to take her down. The commander knew she would take up a lot of their time, but Elstri insisted that the battle would soon turn in their favor, because the future had been foretold. Some of the villagers were injured, but Angvall kept defeating multiple soldiers at once. The commander hadn't expected her to be so strong. He wondered if her gentle nature made her even stronger, as she needed to protect her allies. He watched her swing her sword while many soldiers lay injured in front of her. He realized she had deflected all attacks without killing any of them, striking only with the blunt edge of her sword. He stepped forward to face her, introducing himself as the Ironclad Guillaume, commander knight of a regiment. He told her he had lost many friends in the Western War, but many others had told him that they were saved by her. He expressed his respect for her noble deeds and virtue, but declared it was unfortunate that they had to meet this way. He then challenged her to a duel. Ironclad and Angvall faced each other, their weapons clashing with a loud clang. Angvall took a hit that caused blood to spill from her helmet. The blow left her badly injured, and even her sword broke from the impact. Ironclad told Angvall that her weapon had crushed both her organs and armor. He warned her that she was close to death, but promised not to kill her if she stayed still. She lay in front of him, heavily wounded. A soldier watching from the side thought Ironclad was underestimating her, not realizing the true extent of her strength. He knew this because when he was younger, he had witnessed her troops during the Western War. The town was filled with the stench of corpses from endless fighting, with no reinforcements or supplies coming through. The soldiers were all gravely wounded. At one point, Angvall heard a noise and climbed into a house through the roof. Inside, she found a young girl and saved her. The soldier recounted how the enemies had come in through the back door and slaughtered the girl's parents as they tried to escape. He wondered if the parents had tried to flee, even if it meant leaving their child behind, but Angvall insisted they had no right to judge them. She explained that war and death had stripped people of their humanity, and that it was a devastating experience. Angvall promised she would never give in to evil or fear like that. The soldier urged them to hurry, explaining that they had been ordered to retreat and that the battlefront would be pulled back to the town. Angvall noted that there were still civilians left behind. The soldier told her that the child was the only survivor, but she refused to leave and insisted on searching for more. He knew she was steadfast and would never give in. In the present, despite her severe injuries, Angvall managed to stand up. Ironclad was astonished, as he hadn't expected her to endure such pain. She told him she had withstood worse. Ironclad charged at her again, declaring that he had no choice but to kill her. He taunted her, asking what she would do with a broken sword, believing that the outcome of their fight was already decided and unchangeable. He warned her that he would crush her skull with a single painless blow. He ran towards her and swung his weapon, but she deflected the attack with her hand, leaving him stunned. Seizing the opportunity, she grabbed him and delivered a powerful punch to his face, knocking him to the ground. That decisive strike made her the winner of their duel, celebrated for her remarkable power. After defeating all the soldiers, Angvall placed her sword at Elstri's neck and demanded her surrender. Instead, Elstri began to smirk and laugh. With a hand on her face, she remarked that Angvall had just arrived at the moment she had seen in the future. Angvall was puzzled by her words when suddenly, Aros appeared behind her. Angvall turned to see who it was, but before she could react, Aros struck her with his power, knocking her to the ground. Everyone was stunned to see Angvall nearly defeated by just a single strike. Aros looked around, confused about what was happening. He glanced at Joseph, the Pope, and all the villagers, and then used his power to lift them into the air. He asked Elstri if she wanted him to kill them, but she told him to ignore them and informed him about Julian and the baby he had run off with. Elstri mentioned that Julian was the child of prophecy, and Arcos was disappointed, not expecting a child to be involved. However, Elstri assured him that Julian had supernatural powers like his own. This piqued Arcos' interest. He let everyone fall back to the ground and began to walk away with a smile, saying he was going after the boy. Meanwhile, Titi was exhausted and told Julian she couldn't run any longer. Julian handed her Diana and instructed her to hold on tightly. He then activated his powers and struck the soldiers. Moving swiftly among them, he defeated all of them within minutes. Once the fight was over, he cradled Titi and Diana in his arms. Titi was amazed by his speed, and Julian warned her that more soldiers were coming, so they needed to escape. Titi replied that he should warn her before tossing her around like that next time. The villagers looked around and saw a figure in heavy armor, badly injured, wondering if it really was her. Meanwhile, Arcos passed by, glancing at the injured soldiers on the ground. He smiled, finding the situation interesting, but suddenly, Angvall appeared out of nowhere, declaring she wouldn't let him pass. Arcos assessed her, considering whether her determination to protect others was worth her risk of dying. Angvall stood in front of Arcos and respectfully asked her to step aside, saying she had no desire to fight the son of the Supreme Lord. However, Arcos seemed uninterested as he yawned while listening to her. He smirked and replied that he didn't care, adding that only Julian was worth his time. Angvall thought about how Arcos had inherited godly powers from the Supreme Lord. She pointed out that she didn't see any of the Supreme Lord's character in him. Arcos laughed and called the Supreme Lord a lost cause, revealing that he had heard the Supreme Lord once took whatever he wanted by force. But now, he said, the Supreme Lord was nothing more than a feeble-minded old man who had gone soft and was unworthy of being king. Hearing this, her anger fueled, and she struck at him, but he easily stopped her attack with a smile, using his power. She declared that she wouldn't forgive him for showing such arrogance toward the Supreme Lord. He laughed and asked if she was foolish for rebelling against the very one she served. Smirking, he questioned whether she was in her right mind, reminding her that the child she was trying to protect was prophesied to one day kill the king she served. Raising his hand, he accused her of being half-hearted in her efforts and asked if she truly believed that battlefields were forgiving. She remembered the nights when nightmares kept her awake, filled with endless grief for the comrades she lost in the war. She often thought that she should have died instead of Mera, but at that moment, she realized that Julian was like her, having gone through similar struggles. She recalled sitting by the river once when Julian and Titi came to comfort her, and she thought about how lucky she was not to face her pain alone. Many times she had told herself that she wanted to save those children, but she realized that the one who had been saved was her. She held her weapon and admitted that she was afraid that she had found something she cherished more than her country. But she knew she had to point her blade at him to protect them. With a simple gesture, he used his power, saying he loved using it to mangle the human body. With a single move, he knocked her to the ground and remarked that nothing was as intoxicating as destroying the human form, and that the feeling of absolute power was exhilarating. He smiled, saying that all the corpses hailed him as the greatest, but he had grown tired of dealing with ordinary humans and now craved more thrill, comparing it to playing with dolls. As he thought of Julian, he wondered how he should kill him with his powers. Meanwhile, Angvall struggled to stand, thinking he was pure evil and cared nothing except for crushing others to fulfill his desires. Determined not to let him catch up to Julian and the others, she stood up, injured and covered in blood, firmly holding her weapon, and declared that she had made her decision. She was going to protect those children.